what the research found is that it has a significant association with gender. But when I actually started to open up the Pandora's box, then I started seeing other things. When people apply this method, it improves the experience for everyone.
Welcome to UXR Geeks, where we geek out with researchers from all around the world on topics they're passionate about. I'm your host, Danielle, a researcher and a product manager, and this podcast is brought to you by UX Week, the UX research platform for recruiting, contacting, analyzing, and sharing insights all in one place. This is UXR Geeks, and you are listening to a conversation I had with Danielle, who is a researcher in the FinTech space. She went into exploring the gender problematics in the finance field, which I find super interesting. An episode where it combines more perspective and gives very good clues on what to look for when researching and designing financial services.
We have our first week in the podcast, which I'm really happy about because I never got to connect with a Scandinavian researcher. So Danielle will come, and if you could maybe start with our usual who you are, what do you do, tell us everything about you.
My name is Danielle, and at the moment I work at MasterCard and I sit at the Stockholm office, but I do work in Europe and even outside Europe as well. As a teenager, I became quite interested in psychology, just like seeing different people having different perceptions of the same thing. So that fascinated me quite early on. So I did say when I was about 13 that one day I will become a psychologist. But at the same time, I was also very interested in digital things. So everything with the latest phone and the latest computer or the latest tech. I also wanted to actually study how to create apps and so on. So I had those two interests quite early on. I actually started my own company when I was a bit older. So I didn't study psychology yet. And I didn't go into the digital world yet. But I did have an e-commerce for a few years, and it really taught me like how to listen to customers and also translate that into the website, right, and the e-commerce world. But things happened and I got kids, and then I decided that I have to do something proper, and that's why I actually pursued my passion for psychology. So I did go to the UK and pursue my psychology degree. During my last year, I was thinking like, how can I apply the psychology knowledge that I have into something that is more like tangible? And I just stumbled over human-computer interaction. So those combined my two passions, like psychology and research, with the digital world. So that's how I came into the research bit.
And how was your way to finance? Because that's also a very interesting field for a researcher.
So after completing a master in human-computer interaction, also in the UK, I started working at a consultancy and experience design agency. So that was like my role was UX research. As a consultant, you work on so many different projects with so many different companies. So that was like, I think, my starting point into finances. But it wasn't until I moved back to Sweden a few years later and started working in-house at Lunar, where I really started to come into the financial world.
Can you tell me maybe a little bit more about Lunar? Because I had the chance to see a presentation of Lunar you guys were doing, and it's pretty interesting banking project. So could you maybe a little bit explicate on that one?
I was working as a UX researcher and God, we was doing so many stuff. I think I've done absolutely everything at Lunar. So I've been involved with the AI, I've been involved in activation and onboarding, in end-to-end projects where we're also looking at the different markets. And we were also doing like a massive diary study into Swedes economies. And I think that's one of my most favorite projects because it was so interesting. So the question is rather, what didn't I do at Lunar? Because I probably did everything.
If we could explain a little bit more, what is Lunar to people who don't know it?
Yeah, absolutely. So Lunar is a FinTech challengers in the Nordics. So you could compare it with Revolut or Monzo, where it's a digital first app it has a banking license, so it works like any other bank.
You were mentioning this big Swedish study on the economy, and this is where I feel, correct me if I'm wrong, where you also had the chance to look into the problematics, I will call it problematics, although it's not problematic, of gender in finance. And this is our topic. Could you maybe explore, just for the start, how did you end up doing this and why you were so interested?
It was actually during my human-computer interaction masters, where we had one of the lecturers was actually part of the research team of the GenderMag project, which we were very lucky to have her there. And we had a module called inclusive design. And we got to learn everything from like cultural differences to accessibility and so on. One of the lessons were about the GenderMag framework. And at the time, I was very enthusiastic about it, but I didn't really apply it until much later. So then going into consultancy, working on a lot of the different projects, you don't really notice things like gender differences or cultural differences because you're jumping from one project to the other. So it wasn't until I actually started working in-house, when you're sitting with the same flows over and over, the same designs, when you actually started to see the differences. So that's how I actually came into the GenderMag, because I started to see the differences between men and women when it came to activation and churn and all sorts of stuff. And then I started to dig out the GenderMag framework again and realizing how well aligned it was with something that I was taught a few years before. So that's the way I actually came into the GenderMag framework.
This is where I go a little bit back. What is GenderMag framework? If you could explain that one.
Yes, absolutely. So it is a very large scale project that consists of a lot of studies that has been done. So the GenderMag framework essentially is based on a lot of robust research, but it has resulted in 3 personas. The research, when they were conducting it, they found that people, they are different on 5 dimensions. So there are 5 dimensions of cognitive styles and problem solving. So cognitive styles is how we perceive and think about things that we are exposed to. So it hasn't to do with capability or ability, it's just the way how we process what we're being exposed to, right? And these 5 facets are motivation, information processing, tinkering, self-efficacy, and risk aversion. So those 5 dimensions, what the research found is that it has a significant association with gender. The research found that, for instance, men tend to be more motivated to engage with technology because it's fun, whereas females might just use it because it has a clear outcome for them. So we could see a difference in that. We can also see a gender difference in risk aversion, where females are less risky than males. And we can also see self-efficacy, which is about confidence. So how confident someone feels when they're interacting with technology. And there we see that males have higher self-efficacy than females. And then we come to the tinkering dimension, and that is how likely you are to engage in trial and error behavior. Let's say you open an app that you never used before and you just start clicking around. That's the tinkering part. And what we see, once again, males, they are more engaged in tinkering behavior than females. And information processing, that's one of the other facets or the other dimensions, and that is how we process the information. So we can see that females, they need more comprehensive information to start engaging with something, whereas male are more selective. So those are the 5 dimensions that has been studied, which resulted in those 3 personas. So as you might guess, the 3 personas, one is more extreme female, so very high on risk aversion, very high on, let's say, comprehensive information processing. And then you have a middle persona, which is a mix of female and male behaviors. And then you have the third persona, which is the extreme male behavior. So those are the 3 personas in the GenderMag framework.
What I am really curious about, and you were mentioning it as you were working in-house, and you were looking at the flows and at the research outcomes that you saw the differences. How did it actually apply?
The first thing that I actually observed is when I was doing testing or observing research, and we were looking at onboarding and activation, is that we were noticing that females tended to expect that they should be given more information. So that was something quite interesting, because we keep hearing, oh, I stopped using Lunar because I wasn't given enough information to understand what Lunar was, or I stopped using Lunar because I didn't get information required for me to continue with it. So I never really learned what it was, or it took me like a year to really understand Lunar. And you never heard those phrases with males, because they were more like, I just downloaded it, I thought it was fun, like it was an innovative bank app, and they just started clicking around. And especially when you're working with like apps, they don't have a lot of space, right? So some of the features almost required tinkering. And I think that is one of the, I don't want to say problems, but one of the things that those who work with mobile apps need to think about. The fact that if females doesn't tinker, they won't find features that require tinkering. So those were the things that I started observing, and which led me into the GenderMag. But when I actually started to open up the Pandora's box, right, then I started seeing other things. And for instance, just looking at crypto and investment, men are 3 times more likely to invest in crypto, which I found very interesting. And I'm not that surprised, because talking with females about it, they were also saying it's a bit scary and it's a bit new and it's a bit risky. But just having those data show me that that was backed up internally as well.
What I'm also curious about is that goal setting is more common about women, which was surprising to me because I come from a different cultural background. And it made sense, doesn't make sense. I'm very much torn apart. So could you tell more about that one?
So this was also extremely interesting, because of course I could hear it in the qualitative interviews that I was observing or conducting, that women tended to use the goal feature at Lunar. So the goal feature at Lunar is essentially like a pocket that you can open, and you can put money away for different goals. And you can also see like how close you are to actually achieving that goal. That was like a big favorite with women that we were interviewing. But actually looking at the data, males were converting better on all the things throughout Lunar except the goal feature. So here women were really like overperforming. So they had statistically more number of goals, and also using the goal feature significantly more. And looking at the GenderMag research, we can also see in motivation, that dimension, right, that women are more outcome driven. When they use something, it needs to satisfy, let's say, an outcome or a goal that they are looking for. And I think that is something that was mirrored in the research I was doing as well.
We'll be right back after a short break with a commercial message from our sponsors. Hey UXR geeks, you know this podcast is brought to you by UX Tweak. I've tried several UX research tools before, and most either make recruitment a nightmare or overcomplicate the analysis. UX Tweak is the first one that actually does both well. I can recruit participants from over 130 countries with solid quality checks and detailed profiling, and it supports both moderated and unmoderated studies, and analyzing results doesn't feel overwhelming. It just makes my research smoother. So if you're curious, go to uxtweak.com website and start for free. No credit card and no strings attached.
And this is what I want to address in this episode as well, is the problematics of gender. And you were saying you have 3 personas. I myself, I'm mixing what they call maybe male energy in few instances, but I feel very womanly in most of the things. How did you approach this binary, non-binary topic in the app and in the product itself?
Yeah. When I think about applying GenderMag, I don't think about improving it for females or males. So I don't think about it binary, because what I also see in research is that people are very different on this dimension. It doesn't really have to do with gender. So my father, for instance, he has more of the female interaction behavior, right? My mother needs to help him with his phone app. So I don't want to think about it as like females, all of them, they are risk averse, or all males, they just want to download an app because it's fun. Actually, what I'm trying to do is to use the method to make the experience better for everyone. So everyone that might be on different positions on these dimensions, right? And what we actually see in academic research, Tina, is the fact that when people apply this method, it improves the experience for everyone. It's not just females are benefiting from it. It's actually both genders, and everyone is benefiting from it. So I don't want to think about it in like binary terms, if that makes sense.
It definitely makes sense. One of the things that I was fighting myself and we were discussing endlessly, for example, when I was working on a financial app, was that we had to prove in articles and studies that the narrative is changing amongst young women. I was working in Germany. And that investments, they're more open about it. They do care more about financial future and they take more responsibility for themselves. What we saw face to face in research or in surveys was that it wasn't the story. And we were like thinking about, okay, how do we actually address women, females, or people identifying and socializing as women, because that's the different component that we need to add to it, who just don't feel the empowerment to take care of their finances or go into more risky stuff like investments. And then we were thinking about an educational campaign or stories in the app, which was like, oh, wait a minute, but if we start educating women, we are basically applying of, oh, you don't know about it, so you should learn, girl. And I was like, okay, that's also the point. So it's very complicated, and that's why I was asking about binary, non-binary, how it helps. Do you maybe have an example of improving a thing for women or females and then helping everybody with it in the app?
This is something very important. So what we tend to see, especially with this kind of like FinTech challengers, is that they are very minimalistic. So they strip down the interfaces because it's going to look tidy. But actually, in this case, less isn't more. Because as we can see, some people, they need more information and they need more guidance. And that is something that the GenderMag can really help you understand. So just by putting those personas, you can review the flows that you are designing to make sure it has like the right balance. So it's actually facilitating the male behavior or the interaction behavior and the female. So as an example, I'm thinking about like the flows that we were reviewing. When we did like the onboarding and activation, we were seeing that females, we were losing them at the beginning and they didn't really understand the learner app. Something that we were working on was to be able to send out as a first mini step, a guide just at the beginning to give them that comprehensive information so they don't feel that they're just being shoved into the app and then they have to like tinker around. So that was like one example that was working quite well. But I think it's not only about the design team. I think this is something that is a collaboration across everyone at the company. So it's even like the marketing and PR, like how do we actually communicate with everyone? So it's appealing for everyone. And how do we design it? So it's appealing for everyone and everyone understands it. Even the data team, like how do we put in gender there as one of the data points to understand where we might find differences?
As you were mentioning, the study on Swedish economy or the financial literacy, if I understand it, I am just really curious, and I know it's a little bit off topic, but I have to ask, because when I was working in Germany, it's one of the nations using the most cash in the world. Like they love their ATMs, they love their cash. It's historically going back into even the First World War, which is really interesting. And Sweden is on the other side, all cashless society. And now I think it's 2% of people are using cash right now, which is probably the older generation. What are the things that you saw talking to people and talking to females how it's changing in the society. Could you maybe tell us more about that? I'm so curious.
You're completely right. Like we are seeing, if you're comparing just like the Nordic countries, Sweden is way ahead when it comes to being very financial savvy and quite high on financial literacy. So almost everyone, even like down to 16 years old, they have started investing. So it is quite scary when you do research in Swedes. Yeah. And they have so many different apps, and it's that app and their use of this banking app and that banking app, they're tracking their expenses. So it's quite exciting environment to be in.
And how is it in Timas? Because I'm also a little bit like addressing Swedish politics in it and Swedish feminist movement and how Sweden is as a state supporting solitary parents or even women. The system is very social. So did you see anything there that might be of interest?
So one thing that I noticed is Avanza. So I don't know if you've heard about them before, but they are very big in Sweden. It's an investment platform, and they have been very big in actually supporting women to get into investment. And I think that is very unique. I know as well at Lunar, we had female influencers within investments that were out and talking to conferences. And so there's a lot of support in Sweden in general for investing quite young, but also for females to get into investments. So I think it's a very positive female environment in that sense.
Yeah, and also comparing it with the whole world really makes a difference. Danielle, is there anything that I didn't ask you about and you feel like this is still a topic that we should be talking about?
I mean, I think there's a lot to uncover here. Something that I've been thinking about, something that I realized when I was seeing the differences, is that we are seeing that there are more males that are using FinTech apps and are investing in crypto, etc. And I think there's a risk that we are getting like wealth gap. So if we don't start realizing that we need to design for everyone, we might risk that there is a gap further down the road. And it's also about all of these amazing features that FinTech apps actually have. If we don't design them inclusively with all the interaction styles, there is a big chunk of the population that might be missing out.
This is what I want to stress out here, that with the research work and incorporating people, identity men, and the dominant customers, we are actually doing the social responsibility, not as a CSR kind of thing, you put it on what kind of flag that comes to your mind, but it's really starting from the beginning of the, we are looking into these people, how they could use and even pay for our services so it's usable for them. With that comes a question in my mind, because we have a lot of researchers around, who are listening to us from around the world, working or being somehow important in FinTech. Is there something that you would like to say to people who are working in FinTech that should be taken care of or really start doing or stop doing it?
I think everything that has to do with innovation and something new, keep in mind that big chunk of the population will actually be quite risk averse and need more information, more comprehensive information. So when you're designing something that is a bit innovative, like FinTech, something that can be a bit scary, keep that in mind, that you're not cutting out too much information. So when it comes to like features, be aware that there's a lot of people who are not doing tinkering. So make sure that features or anything that is of benefit is highlighted properly and doesn't require tinkering. But I think as like a final thing, I really encourage everyone to go and look at the GenderMag personas, because they are super helpful and it's a really quick way of actually checking your flows, because you can just download those 3 personas and put them up in Figma and start looking, okay, with my flow here or my design, have I thought about all these different like interaction styles or all the dimensions? Because all the research that is being done everywhere across the world is actually showing that it's making an impact.
Thank you. It was a great conversation. I know we went just really above the surface, but I think it's a great inspiration to actually start looking into it, to anybody out there. If you are looking into genders and your products, not just in FinTech, but in GenderMag is probably your go-to framework. Thank you very much for sharing your wisdom.
And I think I need to credit Margaret Burnett and Simone Stumpf for the GenderMag as well. So Simone Stumpf was one of my lecturers. Yeah. So thank you so much for an awesome framework.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to UXR Geeks. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow our podcast and share it with your friends and colleagues. Your support is really what keeps us going. If you have any tips on fantastic speakers from across the globe, feedback, or any question really, we'd love to hear from you too. Reach out to geekspodcast@uxtweek.com. Special thanks goes to my colleagues, to our podcast producer, Yekaterina Novikova, our social media specialist, Daria Krasovskaya, and our audio specialist, Melissa Danishova. And to all of you, thank you for tuning in.